J'espère que,
I hope
malgré les circonstances
that despite
graves liées à la
the
crise sanitaire,
serious
économique et
health
sociale du Covid, vous
crisis
avez
that
pu
we face with its
profiter de cet
economic and
été pour
social
reprendre un peu de
implications, well, I
repos.
hope despite all this you've
De
been
mon
able
côté,
to
je suis
have
heureux de
a
vous retrouver
restful
à
break this
l'issue
summer. I'm very
de ce
happy to join you
7e round de
again
négociations
at
avec
the
l'équipe britannique.
outcome of this seventh round
Nous avons d'ailleurs
of
maintenu
negotiations with the
avec
British
cette équipe,
negotiating
avec David
team.
Frost,
With David
un
Frost
contact
and
très
his
régulier
team, we have maintained
entre nous pendant
regular
toutes les
contacts.
semaines du mois d'août jusqu'à lundi, et nous nous sommes retrouvés cette semaine pour poursuivre ces discussions.
Continued discussions throughout this week for face-to-face discussions, and I would like to thank the UK negotiating team for having come to Brussels despite all the practical difficulties because of the COVID crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, we continue to work very actively at the
pour nos négociateurs à l'occasion de ces rencontres. Mesdames et messieurs, il nous reste très peu de temps pour conclure ces négociations. Pour qu'un accord entre effectivement en vigueur le 1er janvier 2021, dans 4 mois et 10 jours, un texte juridique complet doit être prêt pour la fin du mois d'octobre au plus tard, afin de laisser le temps nécessaire à la fois au
latest in order to leave sufficient time to the Council and to the European Parliament on our side to approve. We therefore still have 2 months left to find agreement on all the issues under discussion, to consolidate the text and to finalize all the technical annexes, which are far from negligible, and then to have our legal experts verify and validate the text in all the language versions. This is a long and complex task. Any delay beyond the end of October would entail a serious risk as to the successful outcome of this process. In this context, those who were hoping for negotiations to move swiftly forward this week will have been disappointed. And unfortunately, I too am frankly disappointed and concerned and surprised as well, I must say, because the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson told us in June that he wished to speed up the negotiating process during the summer. But this week, once again, as in the July round, the British negotiators have not shown any real willingness to move forward on issues of fundamental importance for the European Union, and this despite the flexibility which we have shown over recent months in terms of taking on board and working with the 3 red lines which Boris Johnson himself set out in June, namely on the role of the European Court of Justice, UK legislative autonomy, and on fisheries. We still haven't seen from our British partners any willingness to take on board the EU's priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing surprising whatsoever about the EU's priorities because they have not changed since 2017. If I could invite you to have a look again at the conclusions of the European Council, resolutions of the European Parliament, we have said repeatedly since 2017 what are our priorities for a balanced and fair agreement with the United Kingdom. And we continue with great patience and goodwill to repeat these. We must have a fair, any trade agreement must go hand in hand with fair standards, mutually agreed standards, a level playing field. We then need, secondly, we need to have a long-term perspective for European fishermen, and thirdly, there won't be any cherry picking. We won't have a la carte access to the internal market because of Brexit. If Britain refuses to accept the rules and obligations of the internal market, Brexit means Brexit. These are not dogmatic or technocratic or ideological approaches by the European Union. There's nothing tactical about this. We have to put this point across clearly, underscoring these priorities which we have repeated over the last 4 years. We have human, social, economic, environmental needs to defend, which remain of fundamental importance for us and which we have to defend. Let me take a very tangible example, that of road freight transport. And this is something which, in the United Kingdom, we've seen this in recent days in the British press, has given rise to a lot of emotion. 4 years after the Brexit referendum vote, what is happening are the clear and direct consequences of the Brexit vote. No one should be surprised at that in Britain. Road transport is a key sector for our economies. It represents millions of jobs in Europe, and it is a sector which also has a direct impact on logistical costs for our businesses, prices paid by consumers, has a direct impact on pollution and climate, and indeed on road safety as well. The British negotiators do not want certain standards to apply to British carriers when they are present on the territory of the European Union. That was repeated again this week. This applies to working hours, to installing modern tachographs in lorry cabins in order to verify working hours and rest times for workers. They have refused to agree to these guarantees on the one hand, but on the other hand, they are asking for a level of access to the internal market comparable to that of a member states which do accept these standards and constraints. Let me just repeat, the United Kingdom has decided itself to leave the single market and has therefore decided to lose the benefits of the internal market. It is Britain's choice, not ours. So, in any case, why should we give access to our roads, to road transport firms, which would not be subject to the same rules in terms of minimum standards and safety? And why should, when it comes to the aviation sector, why should we grant the same access to British operators, to British carriers, as to EU carriers if they are not bound by the same standards in terms of environmental protection and consumer protection? In the same way, why should we agree to the British government being able to create competitive distortions directed against our companies, for example, in granting subsidies or providing derogations in terms of environmental standards or working standards, without any clear regulatory framework agreed between us? So we can see, between underscoring these rather technocratic words, level playing field, but what we're talking about are protecting thousands of jobs in our member states. It's about workers' rights, it's about consumer rights, it's about health, and it's about protecting our environment. Our President, Ursula von der Leyen, has said very clearly that we are prepared to compete with British companies, provided that this competition is fair.
The need for a level playing field is not going to go away. Even if the UK continues to insist on a low-quality agreement on goods and services only. It is a non-negotiable precondition to grant access to our market of 450 million citizens, given the UK geographic proximity and the intensity of our economic exchanges. we are asking for nothing more, but nothing less than what Prime Minister Boris Johnson committed to in our joint political declaration last October, together with the 27 EU leaders. I have a slide for you, not new. Here is a small reminder of those commitments, which were also endorsed by the current UK Parliament, by the way, and supported by the European Parliament also. In particular, paragraph 77, where we agreed, and I quote, "Our future agreement must encompass robust commitments to prevent distortions of trade and to prevent unfair competitive advantages." And I continue to quote, "We should uphold the common high standards applicable in the Union and the UK at the end of the transition period, 4 months from now, in these areas," I quote, stated competition, social and employment standards, environment, climate change, and relevant tax matters. This is the political declaration agreed between us and the UK government. And that is what modern trade policy is about. Not just lowering tariffs and removing quotas. It's about finding agreement between sovereign parties on the rules that will govern future trade. As Commissioner Phil Hogan often says, a modern trade policy must contribute to upholding or even raising rights and standards in the interest of citizens, consumers, and sustainable development. We hear the British government's concern about maintaining its sovereignty and its regulatory autonomy, and we respect that clearly. But no international agreement was ever reached without the parties agreeing to common rules. No international agreement. And I can predict with absolute certainty this will also be the case of trade agreements between the UK and other partners in the future, such as the United States, Japan, and Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, apart from the question of a level playing field, there are still many other areas where progress is needed, and for example, obviously fisheries, where we have made no progress whatsoever on the issues that matter. Governance, where we are still far from agreeing on the essential issue of the dispute settlement. Law enforcement, where we still struggle to agree on the necessary guarantees to protect citizens' fundamental rights and personal data. And also mobility and social security coordination, where our positions are also remain far apart. Nonetheless, to be fully objective, I should add that in some of the 10 tables that convened this week, we were able to make progress on technical issues, for example, on energy cooperation, participation in union programs, and anti-money laundering, among others. And this will be useful when it comes to consolidate together a final text, provided we are able to agree on fundamentals first. However, too often this week, it felt as if we were going backwards more than forwards. Given the short time left, what I said in London in July remains true. Today, at this stage, an agreement between UK and the European Union seems unlikely. I simply do not understand why we are wasting valuable time. Mesdames et Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen, as you will have understood, On the European side, we are very concerned about the state of play in our negotiations. And to be perfectly candid, we don't see how delaying the most difficult issues until later would help us reach a better agreement. We will have to start working on consolidating the legal text. We're willing and able to do that. We already proposed a comprehensive text in March. The British side too have proposed British texts on various issues. But it will only be possible and useful to produce a consolidated text if we do so working together, not each of us on our separate sides. And if we do all of this in parallel, I do hope that this point will come across clearly to our British partners. But we haven't reached that stage yet, because at this point in time, the only serious prospect would be an offer from the United Kingdom would be zero quotas, zero tariffs, without any agreement on the level playing field and without any balanced agreement on fisheries. This is a non-starter, a no-go for us, because it simply blocks everything. Last week, we heard Boris Johnson in his meeting with Taoiseach Michel Martin stressing his desire to reach an agreement with the European Union. He's already said that to us, and that is what we hope for too. I think it is still possible, despite the relatively short time left to us. But in order to achieve this, our British partners will need to come forward with clear, constructive proposals during the next round to take place in London from 7th to 11th of September. Ladies and gentlemen, in parallel with these very complex negotiations, we continue with Vice President Maroš Šefčovič. We continue to be very vigilant on the proper implementation of the withdrawal agreement by 31st of December of this year. As regards the Northern Ireland Protocol, the recent statements by Prime Minister Johnson have stressed how sensitive this issue is, but we hope that the United Kingdom will do whatever is necessary to ensure effective implementation of the legal obligations on both sides in this protocol, which has now been ratified.
Implementation of the protocol is the only way to preserve Ireland's all-Ireland economy, to protect the integrity of the single market, and, above all, to ensure continued peace and stability on the island of Ireland. And in saying this, I want to pay tribute once again to the dedication and determination of John Hume, who sadly left us a few weeks ago.
Coming to one particular aspect of this withdrawal agreement, which we need to implement, citizens' rights, we continue to pay close attention to the full implementation of this agreement on both sides, for EU citizens living in the United Kingdom and British citizens living in EU countries. We are following up on both sides the proper implementation of the commitments set out in the withdrawal agreement. We're working in close collaboration with civil society and with citizens' associations who were present or represented during the second meeting of the Specialised Committee on Citizen Rights, which took place on 6th of August. We see as a key priority tackling the ongoing COVID-19 crisis with all its very serious economic and social consequences everywhere. Nonetheless, despite this priority linked to the COVID-19 crisis, we have to be realistic too in terms of preparing for and facing up to the big changes which will come into play as 1st of January next, the date as of which Britain has opted for economic and trade Brexit. And with or without a trade agreement, there will be major implications. That is a direct consequence of Brexit, and that is why A few days ago, the European Commission began a virtual tour of our capitals to accompany national administrations in preparing for effective Brexit. We have published a readiness communication in all 23 official languages, taking on board the implications for all the players in the European Union, all the measures which our businesses, administrations, and other stakeholders will need to take in order to be as fully prepared as possible for a very new and very different situation as of 1st of January next. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, at the outcome of this round. The next round is scheduled for the week starting on the 7th of September. And in the meantime, with David Frost and his team, we will continue working over and stay in contact over the next 2 weeks, above and beyond the negotiation process and above and beyond the issues on our negotiating agenda. It is the points of substance, which I have already mentioned, which need to be addressed.
Phrase, the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barnier. We now have time for a few short questions on this week's round. I will give the floor, first of all, to Jennifer Rankin from The Guardian.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. Mr. Barnier, can you confirm whether you received from David Frost a draft free trade agreement? And given what you said about the level playing field, if you did receive such a text, it would seem that hasn't made any breakthrough. But could you give us your overall assessment of that document and how useful it is? Thank you.
Madame, tous les documents sont utiles.
Well, all documents we receive are useful indeed. We did indeed receive the new British document outlining the British position. Very often these are repetitions of previous positions. Sometimes there's been a slight amendment or correction, but it's always useful to get these documents so we get a better understanding of each other's positions. But I just would like to recall one thing which needs to be very well understood and maybe is not always very well understood, even though we keep repeating it and have been repeating it over the last 4 years, and we confirm this. This has been confirmed by the 27 heads of state and government and been also confirmed by the Parliament. A trade agreement must comprise 3 indissociable parts. What we proposed, or this is what we proposed, and this is new, this has never been done before in trade. What we proposed was 0 tariffs and 0 quotas for exchange of trade of goods. And the second element is that there would be a level playing field guaranteeing that you have fair play between 2 parties who are very close together. There's hardly a kilometre between, no kilometres at all between Ireland and the UK. And there's a very high level of trade, and there has been for a very long time. And then the third part of this, also linked to trade, is the question of fishing, where we want to have a balanced agreement. So these are 3 essential parts, integral parts of an agreement. It's always a useful thing for the UK to remind us of their position on trading goods and services. It's always a useful thing, as I say. However, we can only work on a consolidated text if we do that together. We can't have everybody operating on a unilateral basis, and we need to work on a whole package because they are all essential parts of this. So my mandate is clear, and I'm repeating this once again so that it's quite clear. If the UK wants to have a trade agreement with the EU and it's going to be no tariffs and no quotas, there must be a credible level playing field. It's got to be applied in a credible way, so that we can avoid dumping on both sides. And we need to have a balanced agreement on fishing, and that is not the case in the documents that we have received. Now, I've repeated this many times before, but I'm saying it to you again now.
I give the floor to Joe Barnes.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mr. Barnier. So, Mr. Barnier, are you willing to see the talks kind of enter into a phase where no deal is a genuine reality by maintaining that you will have to negotiate in parallelism instead of actually looking at the more important topics, first of all, and kind of getting agreements where things are already agreed. Thank you.
Je ne suis pas sûr d'avoir.
I'm not sure I really understood your question properly, but I'll try and answer it anyway. And maybe if you want to take the floor later again to make it clearer, you can. What we want to achieve is an agreement on the most important topics. That's what we're working on. And there are three main groups which make up the comprehensive partnership. On one hand, you have trade, with zero tariffs and zero quotas, with the level playing field and the fishing agreement. Then you have transport, energy, and many other topics as well, linked to mobility in particular. And then finally you have security, which is very important for our citizens on both sides. So those are the main areas that we've done an enormous amount of work on. We've clarified some of these issues. We've made progress since the beginning of this second set of negotiations on future relations. But you asked me to identify the most important topics. I mean, obviously trade lies at the heart of this. That's the hub of the future partnership. And as I said to your colleague, there have to be these conditions, and the conditions are outlined in my mandate.
I'll now pass the floor to Nick Gutteridge.
Hi there. Thanks, Dan. Hi, Mr. Barnier. In your remarks, you said that you were kind of surprised at the approach by the UK, and you questioned why we're wasting time. You sounded a bit like you were losing faith that the British side really wants an agreement and that wants it enough to sort of, make the compromises that you would see as necessary. Have you seen a sort of an attitude change, if you like, on the British side that makes you feel that they no longer value a deal? And just really quickly on parallelism to follow up on Joe, isn't it fairly kind of standard and logical that sides would want to leave sort of, the most important things to them until the last minute as leverage? And aren't you doing it as well? I mean, the UK wants to talk about an agreement on asylum, for instance, the financial services equivalence decisions going very slowly. There are various other things like mutual recognition agreements that the UK wants to talk about. Are you not leaving some of those things back until September or October as well? And isn't that sort of just good negotiating? Thank you.
C'est une phrase.
Now, Nick, I think we've heard before that there won't be an agreement at all until everything is agreed. I think that we can agree on that method, a British method as well. I think the important thing to me is what the British Prime Minister said. I've listened very carefully to what he said. We've had conversations. And last week, the British Prime Minister met the Taoiseach, and he clearly recalled that he wished to have an agreement with the EU. That's the important thing for me. And I understand that. Because if you have agreement, then of course you will have a degree of economic stability, and if you don't, if you look at how trade works between the EU and the UK, if you look at how trade works, if you don't have an agreement, you'll have economic turbulence, and if not social and political disruption. So I think it's in our common interest. That's what the Prime Minister was saying. He was saying it was important for him. I mean, we agree on that. And that is really what the mandate, which has been handed down to me by the 27 heads of state, is about. But it has to be a comprehensive agreement. We won't pay the price of making the single market fragile. We won't take the risk of opening our markets with no quotas, no tariffs to the UK markets. We won't have a situation where our own jobs are threatened or where the social and environmental rights of in the EU are threatened. We want to have a balanced situation. We're not frightened of competition, and President von der Leyen has said very clearly that this is the case. Competition is part of life. We want competition, but we want it to be fair competition. And our philosophy is something which we've heard from the British side as well. It's this new generation of trade agreements. And that's why this agreement won't be like the agreements you used to see 15, 20 years ago in countries which are further away and maybe of less economic significance for us. We want new agreements which are modern agreements. And that's why we understand citizens' concerns. I hear people's concerns. I hear people are expressing concerns about the environment, about social rights, consumers' rights, fair play, and climate change. So I've given you quite a general answer here. Obviously, there are many details in negotiations. I know about tactics. I know that some subjects are sometimes set aside or delayed. But I think it's important to recall also that we're talking about very complex issues, particularly for fisheries, where we're talking about 100 species. It's a very complex area with complex legal implications, state aid as well. We're waiting to see what British policy will be on state aid rules and the non-regression clause, and that takes time. It does take time. We've got good lawyers on both sides, but they need to know exactly what to work on. So that's why I'm concerned, that's why I'm worried and disappointed, because I see that time is passing by and that we are taking a risk. There's a risk of us not being able to ratify the treaty by the end of the year.
Mr. Barnier, I have one final hand up. I give the floor to Vince Chadwick.
Thank you. Hi. I've got a question about development policy. Given that in June you said that the UK had refused to speak about this and you weren't sure why that was the case, just wondering if there's been any more clarity on the future for development and humanitarian relations. Thanks.
No.
No. Very quick answer there. No, because nothing has changed. We're amenable to discussing this. This is of interest to all member states. I'm sure it's of interest to the UK as well to have a preventive framework. It's very useful for us to have that in development, particularly in Africa, for political cooperation for the UN or in sensitive areas, Mediterranean, for example, so that we could have cooperation in external affairs. Sometimes that's useful too for the UK. So it would be very useful to have a workable framework within which to work rather than improvising when a crisis arises. I think the situation in foreign affairs a few years ago made me aware of this need. I don't think the UK wants to discuss this. That's fine. That's their choice. But I'm quite sure this will be the subject of a discussion later once this main hub, the partnership agreement, has been dealt with, and also questions of security. But we are amenable to discussing this. We are open, interested in discussing such an issue, which really does relate to stability in many ways on our continent, and I think you can only have stability if we work together. And this is true of defence issues that I referred to earlier as well.
Now concludes our press conference. A huge thank you to our interpreters and to our technicians as well. We will move over to the midday press conference in the next couple of minutes. Thank you very much and have a lovely weekend.